Hey guys, it's Charles Yeager for Tuts Plus. Today we're going to learn how to create some 80s inspired retro movie titles in After Effects, and we're only going to be using free plugins and assets. Let's take a quick look at a few examples created with this technique. So those were three quick examples, and the first thing is one of the biggest inspirations for these titles was the Stranger Things title sequence. Specifically, there was an article by the Art of the Title talking about the Stranger Things title sequence, giving some behind the scenes of how it was created, and one of the cool things about it was that they actually used After Effects in the creation of that title sequence. So we're going to be using some of those techniques, and one of the things that's worth noting is that we're going to try to achieve a realistic 80s title look. And what I mean by that is we're literally going to try to match the actual feel and look of an 80s title. Often now we see 80s inspired titles that are really exaggerated, kind of over the top, and almost drawing too much attention that they're trying to emulate an 80s title sequence. So we're going to be a bit more grounded because I want the titles to actually feel like a movie from the 80s era. Because of this, the color's not going to be quite as bright, the keyframes won't appear super smooth, we won't be using any motion blur, and overall the image is going to be a bit soft with added film grain. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be creating these titles with free plugins and free assets. The free plugin we'll be using is from Video Copilot, and it's called Sabre. It's perfect for 80s titles, and I'll have a link where you can download that in the description. You're also going to need to download some free film grain from Vision Color. The fonts I'm going to be using are also free fonts from Google Fonts, and again, I'll have downloads for all these links in the description. And finally, you'll need to download the project file for this tutorial. I've included some free sound effects, image backgrounds, and an effects preset for some white grain that we're going to be using later on in the tutorial. With that being said, let's jump into After Effects. Alright, now we're in After Effects. I've went ahead and installed the Sabre plugin, and I've went ahead and imported in some of the film grain from Vision Color. First thing I want to do is just create a new composition. I'm going to have this composition be 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second and be about 14 seconds long. And I'm just going to name this main title and click OK. And the first thing I want to do is just add in a solid black background, that way it's not transparent like this. So I'm just going to right click, new, solid, and I'm just going to call it BG and make sure it's comp size and black and click OK. Now we can go ahead and just create the text and name of our title sequence. So I'm going to select the text tool and just type in my title. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of reformatting on this. I'm going to align it with the center. Alright, so I did a little bit more formatting on my text, got it somewhere where I like it now. And one little trick that you might want to try with your text is doing the bigger beginning and end letters on your titles. That's one of the things they did in the Stranger Things title sequence. It looked pretty neat. And so again, if you kind of want to match this aesthetic, that's something you might want to try. And now that we've got that finished, I'm going to go ahead and add a bar at the bottom of this, kind of also again emulating the Stranger Things title sequence. So I'm just going to right click, do a new solid. I'm just going to name it bar. I'm going to change the color to white, but it really doesn't make that much difference. And click OK. I'm going to turn off the visibility of it for the time being. I'm going to select the mask tool up here, and I'm just going to create a mask underneath this. That looks pretty good. And I'll turn the bar back on visibility and just kind of check the position of it. Move it around just a little bit here. Alright, I think that looks pretty good for the time being. I'm going to turn the visibility on the bar off, and I'm also going to lock the background layer, that way we don't accidentally select it. I'm also going to turn off the Ozark Swamp layer, and the reason for that is we're ready to create our Sabre layer. So I'm going to right click, go to new solid. I'm going to name it Sabre. Make sure it's comp size and click OK. And with that layer selected, I'm going to come to the effects and presets and just type in Sabre. And it'll appear under the Video Copilot effects. I'm just going to apply that to that solid. And by default, you'll see something that looks kind of like a lightsaber. So we're going to come over here and under Customize Core, I'm going to select Core Type and be a text layer. And under Text Layer, I'm going to select the Ozark Swamp. And you'll probably see something that looks kind of like this, really blown out in the beginning. So let's go ahead and refine some settings. Under Preset, I use the preset Neon. And then I'm just going to change the color here to something more along the lines of teal. Maybe a teal green kind of. And click OK. Now I'm just going to dial in the actual settings that I used for the original title sequence that I did. So I'm going to come over here to the glow intensity. I'm going to change that to 16. And now we can see things becoming a lot more visible. For the spread, I'm going to put in 0.04. For the glow bias, I'm going to set this at 0.35. And this core size looks a little bit thick here on these lines. You can see it's kind of clipping. So I'm going to set this to 1.5. Moving a little further down, I'm going to come down here to flicker. And this is going to adjust some of the flicker options on the text here. Currently, we don't have any flicker going on. So I'm going to add in some flicker intensity. I'm going to set this at 50% to start. And for flicker speed, I'm going to set this at 1. I do want it to be flickering, but I want it to be very subtle, kind of like waving through the text. And right now it's flickering all of the text at once. And I actually would prefer it to do just individual letters. So I'm going to check right here, mask randomization. And you can see how that kind of changes things up when I turn that on and off. And when we move through here, you'll see it's kind of just subtly flickering on each of the text layers. It also does kind of give it a very neon look. And a few final refinements I'll do down here under the render settings. I'm going to change the gamma to be 1.2. I'm going to take the brightness down quite a bit to 0.28. So now you kind of see that drastically changes things, gives it a very faded look. And for saturation for the time being, I'm going to leave that at 1. So again, if you need to do any other refinements to this, I may make this a little bit thicker up here in the core size. So I may bump this up to 1.7. Yeah, I like that a little bit better. Now let's go ahead and apply this Sabre effect to our bar below our text. So I'm going to turn the bar visibility back on. And I'm going to select the original Sabre layer. I need to change the mode on this to a screen mode. That way we can see both of them. And on my Sabre layer, I'm going to select the Sabre effect. I'm just going to hit Control-C on the keyboard to copy it to Command-C if you're on a Mac. And I'm going to select the bar layer and just select in the effects and presets and do Control-V or Command-V to paste. And right now you're going to see a duplicate of the text layer, but we need to go ahead and change the core type to be layer mask. And when we do that, you should see the bar light up below your text. And just to accent it a little bit better, I'm going to change the color of the bar. All right, I'm going to go with a red color. Now something else we can do that we probably could have done at the beginning is we're going to animate the scale of the text. So for the time being, I'm actually going to turn off the Sabre visibility. And I'm also going to turn off the bar layer. And I'm going to turn back on our text layer. And I'm going to hit S on the keyboard for scale. So we can keyframe the scale here if we want to through the introduction. And whatever we do to this text, Sabre is going to emulate that because, again, it is basing all of its effects off of this text layer. But before we do animate our title, I want to parent the bar layer to our title text. However, right now I can't see the parent column, so I'm just going to right-click and go to Columns and select Parent. That way we can see it. And so with the bar layer selected, I'm going to parent it to the Ozark Swamp text layer. And you'll see that it is parented to it. So now when we animate the scale of it, it will animate both of them. And just to free up some screen space, I'm going to right-click and remove the parent column real quick. Okay. Now with my title text selected, I'm going to hit S on the keyboard for scale. I'm going to create a keyframe. I'm going to set the scale here to be about 110. That way it's a little bit larger, and I'll move all the way down to about 12 seconds. And I'm going to set this to be about 90. So it's just going to subtly kind of move in. We want to keep it subtle. That kind of matches that 80s era aesthetic. And so now we can go ahead and turn off the visibility of our text. And if we turn back on the bar and the Sabre layer, we should see everything animate in. And there we go. Slowly moving in. You could also animate the tracking of the text and other things on the text the same way. And Sabre will still emulate that. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start keyframing a few things on our Sabre layer to kind of animate the title in. So back at the beginning of our composition, let's animate in the lines kind of appearing on the text like I initially had on the Ocean Abyss title sequence. And the way we're going to do that is under the Customize Core, the Start Offset. So you can see if I just drag this along, how the text kind of appears and disappears. So in the beginning, I'm going to set this to be 100% at the very beginning of our composition. I'm going to go ahead and create a keyframe at 100% on Start Offset. I'm just going to move all the way down to where this ends at 12 seconds. And I'm going to set that start offset to be 0. And that'll automatically create another keyframe. With the Sabre layer selected, I'm going to change the color of it just so we can see it a little bit easier. And if I hit U with that selected, you'll see the keyframes that we just created. I'm also going to animate in the bottom bar, but I'm not going to do that just yet because I want to do a few more things to our text. So something else I want to kind of keyframe in is the flicker. I want it to flicker a lot more at the beginning, and then kind of near around 10 seconds or so, I want the flicker to kind of change and flicker a little bit less. So if we come down here to flicker, I'm going to do a keyframe on the flicker intensity. And if I hit U again on the keyboard, we can see the keyframe for flicker intensity. And then again, when it gets to about 12 seconds, I'm going to drop that to about 35. Just a little. But something else I want to do at the same time, throughout the actual entire animation, I want the glow bias to actually increase so the glow of the text kind of becomes more prominent as it gets closer to the end. So I'm going to create a keyframe for that at the beginning to be 0.35. And then by the time we reach, again, 12 seconds, I'm going to raise this to be 0.55. So a little bit more of an intense glow. One other cool trick that I did on the Sabre layer when it hit the actual peak right at the end was I quickly increased the saturation of that text to kind of give it a little bit of a pop. And this was kind of something I saw in a lot of 80s titles. This type of thing happened, particularly when they're kind of animating in animation cells, and by the time they reach the final animation cell, a lot of times it'll be subtly different in color tone. So in order for us to do that, let's just come down here to the saturation. Under render settings, you'll see saturation. And so I'm going to go ahead and move one frame before our 12-second ending. So in order to do that, I'm going to put the current time indicator right at 12 seconds. I'm going to hit page up on the keyboard. That's going to move me back one frame. And so I'm going to do a keyframe on saturation right there to be 1. And then I'm going to hit page down, so we're only moving down one frame. And I'm going to raise this to be about 1.5. And you can see it's going to add just a little bit of extra pop on our text there. It may change the color of your text a little too much, so you may need to adjust your glow color if it offsets it a little too much for your taste. But right now, right when that pops, I want the bar to kind of animate on. So I'm going to minimize the Sabre, and for the bar layer, I'm going to hit M for mask. And we're going to go ahead and animate the mask coming in. So I'm going to toggle the mask visibility down here, so now we can see the mask. And I'm actually going to solo the bar layer just so we can see it a little bit easier. And so what I want to do now is animate the mask path. So I'm going to make a keyframe for mask path. If we zoom in here, I want this bar to appear in about half a second. So I'm going to move down about 12 frames. And I'm going to create another keyframe. And actually that's going to be the ending keyframe. So if we move back forward to our first keyframe, just make sure you're hovering right above it. I'm going to select it. And what we can do is just select this mask and just kind of animate it in. So I'm going to turn on the title action save just so I can see where the center is. I'm just going to double click on this mask and select the ends of it and hold Control. And that's going to squeeze it in. And when it's really thin, I'll just leave it right there. And now we can see it's very thin. And so what we can do is I don't want it to be appearing there the whole time. So I'm going to zoom back out. And on the bar layer, I'm going to select the end of it. And if we hold Shift, it'll just snap here to that first keyframe. And so now we can see how that kind of animates on. And one other thing I want to do at the end when this appears, I'm going to select that last keyframe, and I'm going to make this an easy ease keyframe. I'm going to hit F9 on it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and unsolo that bar layer, and let's go ahead and do a quick RAM preview just to kind of see where we're at right now. All right, so you can see we get a nice slow introduction with the lines appearing. And the slower, to me, seems a little bit better. It seems to match more of the 80s style. And now you can see we get a nice pop right there at the end when the saturation kicks up and then the bar kind of animates in. So that looks good to me. I might actually select the Sabre layer and I'm going to hit U. And I may dial down the ending glow bias just a touch here. 0.45. That looks a little bit nicer. Another thing we can do is add a subtle shake to this text. We don't want to do too much. We don't want to make it seem like we're intentionally trying to give this a VHS look. We just want it to be extremely subtle so that people kind of feel it more than they actually notice it. And the way we can do that, if we select our text layer down here, because the bar is parented to it, all we need to do is animate the actual text. So I'm going to hit P on the keyboard with the text selected. And I'm going to hold Alt and click on the stopwatch here. And you're going to see the expression box appear. And I'm just going to type in wiggle. And then parentheses 2, 2, and then in parentheses. And that's going to do 2 shakes per second at 2 pixels. So it's going to be, again, very subtle. With the compression of this tutorial, you might not be able to notice it, but again, when you watch this back in full HD, you can see it's just subtly giving it a nice little shake. Again, we don't want to draw too much attention to it to make it look like we're intentionally doing this, because again, in the 80s, this was kind of an unwanted mistake. They wanted to keep as minimal of shake as possible, but because these kind of animation cells were done by hand, there was going to be a little bit of subtle shake. And finally, one more thing I like to do to kind of give this a little subtle accent is do a little bit of optics compensation on this. I'm going to right click and do a new adjustment layer. I'll move that to the very top of everything. And I'm just going to name it OC. And with that layer selected, I'm going to go over here to Effect, Distort, Optics Compensation. And so what this effect does is kind of gives us that little TV effect on everything. You can see when I dial this up, it's kind of wrapping everything, rounding everything off. Now, again, you don't want to do this too much either. What I typically do is I just check on reverse lens distortion. I like it to kind of be warping outward. And I'm just going to set it on something very subtle like 20. It's really not going to be that noticeable. If I check this on and off here, you can barely notice anything happening. I might bump this up a little bit more to like 25. But again, it's very subtle things like this that can make a big difference. So the next thing we're going to do is add some chromatic aberration on our title, and this is really going to sell the retro look. So in order to do that, we need to select all of our layers except for the background. So I'm going to select OC, I'm going to hold Shift and select our text layer. And I'm just going to come up here to Layer and then Pre-Compose. For me, it's just off the screen. And I'm going to name this Title Text. And on this one, I'm going to add a dash and add red to the title. And you'll see why we're doing that in just a second. I'm going to click OK. Now with that layer selected, I'm going to come up here to Effect, Channel, and add in Shift Channels. So what this effect is going to do is isolate the different color channels of our title, and it's going to enable us to kind of give it that chromatic aberration effect. And since we already named this the red title, I'm going to come up here, and for red, I'm going to have it output red. And for green, I'm going to select full off. And for blue, I'm going to select full off. So in some cases, you may not see anything at all if there's no red actually in the top title, which is the case here, except for the bar. So I'm going to come down here to this composition, and I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate it, or Command D on a Mac. I'm going to hit Enter. I'm going to rename this green. And with that layer selected, I'm going to come here to the effects of the shift channel effect. Should still be on there because we duplicated it. But for red, I'm going to put that to be full off. And for green now, I'm going to select it to be green. Now I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that composition one more time. So I'm going to select it, Control D, Command D on a Mac. And I'm going to hit Enter to rename this blue. And with that selected, I'm going to go over here to the effect that's on it and set green to be full off and blue to be blue. And right now you should see something that's mainly blue. And obviously that's not what we want, so we need to come down here to the different modes and set them all to screen. Now technically you don't have to do it to the bottom one, but just in case you have something that's going to appear behind it later, I'm just going to set this to screen as well. So now your colors of your title should look exactly the way they did before. So there's some cool tricks we can do now to these individual layers to give it a nice chromatic aberration effect. I'm going to zoom in here just so we can see this a little bit better. And on the blue layer, I'm going to select it. And I'm going to hit S for scale. I'm going to make this to be 101%. And now if we look here, you can see some nice fraying around the edges because of the way that's scaled up. And something else I like to do when I scale it up, I like to add a nice blur to this. So I'm going to leave that layer selected and go to Effect, Blur, Fast Blur. And I'm just going to set the blur here to be about 6. And you can see that kind of enhances the fray a little bit there. I'm also going to select the green composition. I'm going to add the blur effect to it as well. And we can tweak it. You can see how this really can get out of hand quickly. We have a lot of green on this, so that looks pretty good. And for the red channel, I might just adjust the scale of it very slightly. This will be about 99.5. One other trick I like to do sometimes is just to add kind of a ghosting layer. So like on our red layer here, I might duplicate that. And I'm going to have this bottom one be the ghost layer, so I'm just going to hit Enter and name it Ghost. And with it selected, I'm actually going to come up here and delete the Shift Channels effect. But I'm going to hit T for opacity. I'm going to dial down the opacity quite a bit. Something like 10% for the time being. And I'm just going to kind of drag it with it selected. I'm just going to move it. You can see how we have that ghosting layer. Now I have snapping on, so I'm going to turn that off. So I'm just going to move it just slightly so you can see we kind of get this subtle ghosting effect going on. Now you may or may not like that with your particular title, so it's entirely up to you. And the lower you set this, the more subtle it is, the more effective it's probably going to be. Just kind of gives a nice double ghosting effect. I'm going to set mine to be about 8%. And something else you can do is also add a blur to this. So I'm going to go to Effect, Blur, Fast Blur, and you can adjust the blur on that. So you can see when I check this on and off, we just a little subtle edge. And actually, just for the sake of this tutorial and so y'all can see it a little bit better, I'm going to make the blue scale a little bit more extreme. I'm going to set it to 102. And you can see we're getting a lot of blue around the edges. Now the next effect that I went ahead and did in the original sequence, it's not required, but it was a subtle wave kind of over the overall title. Because the title had the word ocean in it, in this case has swamp in it, I'm going to go ahead and do it on this title. So I'm just going to right click and select new adjustment layer. And I'm just going to select it down here, hit enter and name it warp. And with that layer selected, I'm going to come here to the effects and presets and just type in turbulent displace. And you'll see it appear under the distort effect. So I'm going to select it and just drag it onto that adjustment layer. And you can see right now this doesn't look good at all. It's way too extreme. So we want this to be very subtle again. So for the amount, originally I just put it on 3. And for the size, I put it on 21. And so you'll see this is very subtle. If I just check it on and off, you'll hardly notice any difference at all. But you can see it's just adding a very slight warp to the overall text. Again, this is kind of playing into that imperfections of the animation cells being done individually. All right, so let's go ahead and add our grain on top of our footage. So I'm going to go ahead and move back to the very beginning of our composition. And I'm going to select the 35mm grain footage that we got from Vision Color. I'm just going to drag that into my composition, place it on top of it, and for the mode, I need to set this on overlay. And right now, because everything's black, we can't see it. If you want to adjust the scale of it, you can. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as is. And what we need to do is we need to duplicate this so that it appears over all of our footage. So I'm just going to select it. I'm going to do Control-D, Command-D on a Mac. And I'm just going to select that duplicated layer, hold Shift, and it should pop right here at the end. You can see how it snaps, so it's perfectly aligned. And I'm just going to keep duplicating that throughout my entire composition. So now if we move to the end of our composition and we zoom in here, you can see the grain has this nice effect on the glow of everything and also accents the chromatic aberration quite nicely. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick RAM preview of this. Definitely starting to look a lot more 80s inspired. Now something else they did on the Stranger Things titles is they had a very subtle white grain that appeared. It was very sporadic, but it contrasted fantastic with the black background. And so let's go ahead and add that. So what we need to do for that is I'm just going to right click and create a new solid. And I'm just going to name it white grain. And click OK. And so this is where the effects preset that I included with the project files comes in. You don't have to use it. I'll go ahead and show you what it consists of. But once you have that installed, it's very easy to just drag and drop it onto a solid layer. So I'm going to come here to Animation Presets. Under User Presets, I've got the white grain effects preset. So I'm just going to drag that and apply it to my solid. And when I do that, it's going to add some extremely subtle white grain to this, and you may not even be able to see it on all the frames when you scroll through. But what it consists of is a fractal noise and a levels layer that I did some tweaking on to kind of give the effect of white grain appearing on the footage. And right off the bat, if it's a little too subtle for you, just come over here and turn off the levels effect. And you can see it's going to make some of that white grain pop out a little bit more. It's one of those things, again, that you kind of feel more than you actually see it. I'm going to go ahead and move to the end of the composition, and we need to set this to a screen mode so that we can see our text through it. But if you do want more of the grain to appear, you can come over here to the contrast of the fractal noise and just pull it up. And you'll slowly start to see more white grain appear. So really it's up to your preference on how much you want to see. If you do too much, it may kind of come across as snow. So I'm going to leave that up a little bit, but I'm going to turn the levels effect back on so it kind of crunches down on some of those. And that's pretty much the core of this retro title sequence. But if you want to do a fade out of your title, something I noticed on a lot of 80s titles is it doesn't fade out overall. It kind of does more of a central organic fade. And I'll show you a way we can emulate that as well. Now, one thing I did, I went ahead and lengthened the composition length for my title. So if you need to do that, just right click, go to composition settings, and I changed mine to 20 seconds. You'll need to do that for the main title, but you'll also need to do that for your title text pre-composition. So just select it, and again, right click, go to composition settings, and change the duration there. All right, so let's go ahead and create this kind of organic fade out. So what we need to do in the project panel, I'm going to select a new composition, and I'm just going to call this light out. Make sure it's the same frame rate and click OK. And in this new composition, I'm going to right click and do a new solid. I'm just going to name it BG, And for the color, I'm going to have it be white and make comp size and click OK. Now we actually need this layer to be 3D, so you may need to come down here and select toggle the switches and just check on the 3D box there. So now we need to add a light into this scene, so I'm going to right click and do a new light. And for the light type, I want it to be a point light and have it be at 100% and click OK. And so what I want to do is move this light kind of the center of the composition. So I'm going to turn on the title action safe, and I'm just going to move it to the center. It doesn't have to be. And so with our light layer selected, I'm going to hit T on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up our intensity for the light. And for the very beginning, we want the intensity to be dialed up really high so that everything is completely white, because when it is completely white, that's going to be when our title is visible. So I'm just going to pull up the intensity here until everything is a solid white color. And I'm going to create a keyframe, and I'm just going to move down to about 2 seconds and just keyframe this down to 0. And you can see it's going to give us a very natural fall off here. And if you want, you can add in some kind of subtle flickers here of manually keyframing things if you want to add a flicker effect when it fades out. Okay, so once we've got that keyframe, let's go ahead and move back to the main title. And I'm going to set the current time indicator to around 16 seconds. That's going to be when I'm going to start my fade out. And so what we need to do is select our light out composition, just drag it in and place it right there around 16 seconds, the beginning of it. And it should be totally white for the time being, and that is correct. So under mode, we're going to set this to be multiply. And so now your title should look completely normal. If you are having any issues like you see the grain, just come down here and make sure your background layer, the black background layer, is all the way the length of your composition. So now since we put that on multiply, if we just subtly move through here, you'll see the text begin to organically kind of fade away. So I'm going to do a quick RAM preview of that so we can see that. And so now you can see we get a nice organic fall off on the title there. Finally, the last trick I want to show you is on the credits or even on your title sequence, how to give everything that subtle kind of red film burn effect when it's fading in and fading out. That again was something that was very popular on the Stranger Things credits. So I'm going to come over here to this credits text composition I've already created. And what I've got in this composition is a black solid background. I've got some text, and I went ahead and added in the grain above everything right there. And I put all the grain to be in an overlay mode. We can see that here. And for the time being, we'll go ahead and shy everything else away, just except for the text. That way we can just focus in on that. So if I zoom in here and we look at the text, we can see it's a little too crisp. So the first thing we need to do is kind of soften everything up. So with the text selected, I'm going to go to the effects and presets and just type in glow. If we scroll down, you'll see stylize glow. So I'm going to select glow and just apply that to the text. We'll do a few quick adjustments over here on the glow threshold. I'm going to set that to be 80. For the glow radius, I'm going to put it at 45. So it's going to give us a very wide glow on everything, but right now it's a little too bright. So I'm going to add a levels effect to this text. Type in levels. And under color correction, I'm just going to select levels and apply that to the text. And I want to adjust the output white because I don't want it to be this bright. So I'm just going to pull that down just subtly there. Now we can kind of see we get a little bit of a gray color. I'm going to go ahead and lower these just so they're out of the way. Next thing we need to do is add a fast blur. I'm just going to set that at 1 just to soften things up a little bit more. And the biggest effect that's going to help us do this properly is the tint effect. So I'm going to come here and type in tint. And it's also under color correction, and just apply that to our text. And for the map white, I'm going to select that. I'm going to set this to be a darker red color, kind of a dull red, and click OK. So essentially what we want to do is fade in our text and then also fade in and out this tint effect. You can see, you can probably get a good idea of how we're going to do this now. So I'm going to leave the tint amount to be 100%, and with the text selected, I'm going to hit T for opacity, and I'm going to create a keyframe and set this to be 0. And so I'm going to zoom in here, and I just want to move down about 12 keyframes, so we can see the 12 keyframes right there. And I'm going to have the opacity go up to 100%. However, we don't want it to be red the entire time. We want it to kind of do that double fading effect. So I'm going to come here to about in between, right in the middle, and I'm going to do the keyframe on the amount to tint. And now if I hit U on the keyboard, we can see that tint keyframe. And so I'm going to go all the way to the end again, right at 12 keyframes, and I'm going to set the tint amount to be 0. And just to add a little bit more to this, on that tint keyframe, I'm going to hit F9 to make it an easy ease keyframe. So before I RAM preview this, I'm going to move this text down just a little bit here so we have a little bit of black at the beginning when we RAM preview this. So now we can get an idea of how this works. You can see as it fades in, we have that red prominence and then it fades away, so you get that kind of film burn effect on your credits. So you can use the same effect on your titles. You can also use it when you fade the text back out. And whenever you do finish up your titles, I do want to emphasize the effect that sound design will have in accenting the titles. It definitely plays a big part. Here's the final sequence that I created from this tutorial. Alright guys, hopefully you picked up some tips from this tutorial. And again, make sure you download the project file. It'll also have the After Effects file with some of the title sequences that I previewed in this tutorial. This is Charles Jaeger for Tuts Plus. Thanks for watching.